At the end of last class, we indulged in a little bit of nihilism. The nihilism that comes from the revelation that World War I has ended. It's ended with over 20 million dead, 10 million military deaths, and 10 million civilian deaths. And that is on top of 22 million people worldwide who have died due to the Spanish flu. So 1914 to 1918, that was a pretty bad 4 years. And the question is, what has it all been for? At the end of last class, we talked about how the United States has already faced that very same question during the American Civil War. And our answer, or at least Abraham Lincoln's answer, was to make the slaughter of the Civil War justified by the war itself bringing an end to slavery. So the Civil War was a particularly bad war, but theoretically, the sacrifice was justified by what it accomplishes. Question is, what is World War I going to accomplish? And that question is something that where there's profound disagreement, not just between the Allied powers and the Central powers, but within the Allied leadership. But there's another issue in the background in terms of how to sort of wrap up the First World War. And the issue is, how can you prevent another similar war from occurring? I don't know. Maybe theoretically, World War I could have a sequel. Maybe it'll be called World War II or something. How do you prevent that war? And I don't know. When you think about it in those terms, it's kind of creepy because you realize that the Allied leaders who were negotiating the end of the First World War were trying to prevent the very war that happened anyway, World War II. But the thing is that World War One is certainly not an isolated conflict. In fact, World War One is just the largest of a series of broader European wars that kind of spill out across the world. In fact, our national independence was created because of one of these larger European wars kind of expanding beyond the boundaries of Europe. If you think about it, you have the 30 Years' War, you have the War of the Spanish Succession, you have the French and Indian War. The American Revolution does also become kind of a general European war. You have the Napoleonic Wars, and now the whopper of them all, the First World War, has destroyed an entire generation's worth of blood and treasure in Europe. And it's got to stop. In fact, it is existentially vital that there never be a war like World War One again. The Allied leaders who meet in the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris to negotiate the end of the First World War believe that human civilization itself cannot withstand another conflict on the scale of World War One. And of course, the depressing revelation is that the leaders at Versailles, especially if you look at World War II, profoundly underestimated our species' tolerance for blood and slaughter and suffering. But those are the stakes. The Allied leaders are meeting in Paris not just to negotiate an end to the First World War, but also to prevent another similar war from ever occurring again. But the question is, how do you do that? And again, the answer is going to depend upon what leader you're talking to. If you're asking Georges Clemenceau, the president of France, or David Lloyd George, the prime minister of Great Britain, their answer would be something to the effect of, let's bring Germany down to size. That really the problem of the First World War was a German problem. And so if you limit Germany, if you cut down their military and their industry, if you force them to take some level of responsibility for the conflict, then ultimately you're going to prevent another similar war from ever happening. Woodrow Wilson, though, has a very different approach. And this is kind of interesting when you think about who Woodrow Wilson is. Woodrow Wilson was the person who, remember, is elected without any interest in foreign policy whatsoever. And of course, I've said the quote many a time that when he's elected, he says, "It would be the irony of fate if my administration had to contend chiefly with foreign affairs." And now, during the end of the First World War, Woodrow Wilson has to deal with precisely that. Wilson is convinced, like much of the rest of the world, that human civilization can't take another global conflict like the First World War. And in his mind, the problem of war is a legal problem. When somebody breaks into your house, well, the thing is that you have laws, you have a legal system, you have police to deal with that particular problem. But if you apply that system to countries, well, what do you do if Kaiser Wilhelm II, maybe the guy's not breaking into your house, but he's breaking into Belgium. He's trying to occupy most of Western Europe. So the question is, when a country rather than an individual tries to act in an aggressive manner, what laws prevent them from doing that? And the answer is there aren't very many laws. The thing is that you have laws that govern individuals, but you don't really have laws that govern states. So Wilson asks this question: why not? Why don't you have a legal system that controls the behavior of states like you have laws that control the behavior of individuals? And of course, the answer to that question leads to the creation of the League of Nations and, in the long term, the United Nations. And I mean, think about that. Wilson's maybe not the father of the United Nations, but he's at the very least the grandfather of the United Nations. And this is coming from a person who really doesn't have any passion or interest, at least at first, in foreign affairs. But because of the First World War, Wilson does this about face, and suddenly he becomes monomaniacally focused on the creation of some kind of international legal framework. Let me elaborate a little bit more on the different interests that the Allied leaders have going into Versailles. All of them want to prevent a future war. But again, the question is how. This is President Georges Clemenceau here on the left, and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George here in the middle. Um, both have both lead countries that have suffered unprecedented losses during the First World War. For example, in Great Britain, the British lose something like 1 million people in total. In the Second World War, they lose less than half that many. Approximately 20% of the French population was killed or wounded in the First World War. And that's the population as a whole. I mean, if you think about this, that's roughly 1/3 of French males of military age were killed or wounded in the conflict. So if you think about what this means, it means that every single family is touched by the First World War in some way, shape, or form. And again, what Clemenceau and Lloyd George face pressure to do is to somehow make that okay. And, trying to I don't know, justify the loss of a loved one. I mean, there's no way that anybody, politician or not, can really do that. That's a pretty tall order. But both leaders try to figure out how they can somehow explain or justify those extraordinary casualties. Remember, Woodrow Wilson doesn't face those same political pressures. I mean, the United States loses about 110,000 people in total, about 48,000 of those losses in combat. But again, you don't have that sort of generational bloodletting that happens for the United States like you do for Western European nations. So what Clemenceau and Lloyd George want in varying degrees is they want either some kind of financial reparations. This is what you call an indemnity, in which the Germans, or really the Central Powers, but let's be honest, mostly the Germans, since they were the wealthiest country in Europe, they want the Germans to kind of pay for the cost of the war. They also want a fair amount of revenge. This is more or less a French thing, but the idea is that for the French, World War I was comeuppance for an earlier war, the Franco-Prussian War, that was fought in 1870 to 1871. The Germans had annexed, or in other words, they had taken over some French territory along the Rhine River. The French are going to want it back. And finally, they want expansion of overseas empire. Both the British and the French will push for expansions of their overseas empires at the expense of mostly the Germans and the Ottoman Empire. Now, before the United States joined the First World War, um, basically the British and the French had this understanding that when the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, both the British and the French would jointly occupy the Middle East. It has to be remembered, by the way, that the Ottoman Empire consisted of not just present day Turkey, but it also occupied Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, what we would today call Israel or Palestine. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was a pretty big deal, literally. But the thing is that the Ottoman Empire was on the verge of collapse. Admittedly, there's this old joke that the Ottoman Empire had been on the verge of collapse for like the last 200 to 300 years, but it looked like it was finally going to go through with it. It's kind of like, the Ottoman Empire is that person who's been on their deathbed since their 50s and they make it to their 90s. But anyway, the Ottoman Empire looks like it's finally going to collapse. And the question is, what do you do with that territory? Well, the British and the French, they agree basically to carve it up and divide it between the two of them. Now, to be honest, at this point, um, this is kind of typical wartime behavior. I mean, there's this concept that in wartime, to the victor goes the spoils. But what was super awkward for the British and the French is that in making war against the Ottoman Empire, they kind of had some help. So this is T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, who is a British translator and Middle East expert who is sent to help an Arab rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, led by Prince Faisal here. This Arab rebellion is fairly successful. It helps weaken the Ottoman Empire. And the thing is that the British promise these rebels that if they manage to push the Ottoman Empire out of the Middle East, that these rebels will be given self-rule. Well, that's not what the Sykes-Picot Agreement says. This was a private understanding between the British and the French, and the Russians, it has to be said, um, that when the war ends, no matter what promises are made to other people, the territory that is occupied by the Western Allies will be controlled by the Western Allies in the near future. And I suppose if people like Prince Faisal don't like it, well, what are they going to do about it? The British and the French have won the war. So, to be honest, there's not much they can really do. Well, that's the way it looks, but you might remember that in 1917 there is a revolution in Russia. What happens is that as the Bolsheviks occupy the capital of St. Petersburg, they go into the foreign ministry and they start looking through the papers of the old imperial government. And they find, I think in a sealed vault that they actually have to blow up in order to access, they find a copy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement that had been delivered to the Russian government. So, what happens is that right after the United States joins the Western Allies and declares war on Germany, the Russians under Vladimir Lenin leak this agreement. Woodrow Wilson says that the United States is at war to make the world safe for democracy. But if you look at it, if you look at the Sykes-Picot Agreement, an argument could be made that the United States hasn't gone to war to make the world safe for democracy. The United States has gone to war to help expand the British and French Empire. And remember that America expanding its own empire during the Spanish-American War was controversial enough. To say nothing about expanding other people's empires, especially one empire in particular. I mean, we kind of have some mommy issues related to, our history, our association with the British Empire. So that was super controversial. And of course, many critics, many of the conscientious objectors, many of the progressive activists who objected to the war were quick to point out that this is an example of how World War I is actually a war for European imperialism, not for any highfalutin idea like democracy. That all being said, this system, this pattern, or if you want to be fancy, you could use the word paradigm, of countries taking territory, land, after the end of the war. I mean, that's nothing new. But Wilson argues or believes that this system is precisely the problem. So France is super gung-ho about going to war against Germany in 1914. And one of the reasons why France is super excited, super gung-ho about going to war against Germany is that the French had their own territory taken in 1871 by Germany. And the reason the Germans took that territory in 1871 is because Louis XIV, back in the 16 and 1700s, took that land when France was fighting its wars of expansion. So Wilson's wondering, like, where does it end? I mean, you can redistribute land however you want, but instead of solving a problem, you actually might just make the problem even worse. It might lead to future conflicts. So, to address all those concerns, Wilson responds by issuing the 14 points. And the 14 points, fortunately, you don't have to know all 14 of them, but I am going to expect you to know at least 6. So, you should think of the 14 points in the same category as well, let's say it's in the same category as Washington's farewell address, or the Monroe Doctrine, or the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember that the United States is not the most outward-looking nation in general. There's this isolationist trend in American foreign policy, but the 14 points does become kind of one of the foundational works or ideas for American foreign policy in the 20th century, especially. So, the 14 points, or at least the 6 points you have to know of the 14 points. So, the first and arguably the most important is this concept called self determination. Self determination is the legal right of people to decide their own destiny via democracy. So, when I mentioned that Woodrow Wilson wants to make the world safe for democracy, I mentioned that he's actually serious about this. So, how do you make the world safe for democracy? With democracy, according to Woodrow Wilson. You allow people to democratically choose um, their government and whether or if they should be occupied or controlled by a foreign power. And by the way, in most cases, the answer would probably be no. So the idea is that if people have a right to choose their own destiny and to rule their own land and all that, well, then there's not going to be any wars for empire. Democracies don't do that. By the way, that's Wilson's opinion. That's not necessarily how it actually works in reality. But this is a really radical idea. And this idea that people, all people, should have the right to choose their government and to basically choose their own destiny. This was very popular not just in Europe, but also in colonies occupied by European powers. There's a little bit of ominousness here because Wilson kind of becomes this almost messianic figure, just about, for independence movements across the world. They look to Wilson and his idea of self-determination as the basis for their own national independence. But, the question is, who gets self-determination? So, you know, this is being recorded in the year 2020. The COVID-19 outbreak is spreading. And so I'm quarantined in my house. And I'm thinking, believe it or not, I'm kind of an introvert. And to a certain extent, being quarantined is kind of an introvert's fantasy. So if I'm self-reliant and I can kind of be by myself, why don't I just go ahead and declare the right of self-determination to create my own nation, my own society out here in the woods? Well, that might seem absurd, but who do you give self-determination to? Do you give it to cities or tribes? Do you give it to nationalities? In other words, groups of people who profess to belong to some kind of nation? Well, the thing is that nations aren't based around race or ethnicity or anything like that. A nation is an idea. So the thing is that there's no clear-cut answer as to how far self-determination should go. But just remember that question. Self-determination seems like a really fantastic idea in practice. It's democratic, it's egalitarian, but there are still questions as to who should get the right of self-determination. So, along with self-determination, you have this appeal for open alliances. The thing is that World War I was made worse, arguably, because you had some European powers who were kind of allied to one another on the down low, and nobody was really sure who was going to help who in the event of war. I'm not necessarily going to spend a huge amount of time on this because this is more of a European history point, but you can kind of see Wilson, the idealist and the moralist, in this point. The idea that alliances should be open and transparent. Freedom of the seas. This is more of a U.S. thing. And arguably, it's kind of a simple point, but freedom of the seas is a direct response to the U-boat campaign, the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign launched by Germany twice during the First World War. Reduced armaments. This is kind of a response to this period in Europe right before the war, where you see this enormous amount of spending on armaments, especially new naval warships, new battleships, that kind of thing. And the argument is that rather than weapons providing deterrence, it instead sort of creates this atmosphere of militarism where people view war as, let's say, a rational possibility, as a way to solve a country's problems. Now, this is another big point, free trade. Woodrow Wilson is a huge proponent of free trade. And free trade today, at least, before the last couple of presidential elections, was something that Americans tended to support on a bipartisan basis. The idea that you, or as a country, we should be able to have a free exchange of goods with other countries without having to worry about tariffs or trade restrictions. And remember that, yeah, even though this is something that emerges during the 20th century, historically Americans have been a little leery of free trade. Remember that Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay were not huge proponents of free trade. In fact, they believed the United States should enact a protective tariff to protect American businesses from European competitors. Well, something that happens in the 20th century is that the United States surpasses European countries in terms of overall industrial strength. So what kind of happens is, instead of the U.S. Being worried about European competition, instead what happens is we worry about other countries' tariffs, because now Europe has to be afraid of the United States. We could put European businesses out of business rather than American businesses have to worry about foreign competition. So that gives you a little bit of context as to why Woodrow Wilson specifically during this time period would support the idea of free trade. But it kind of seems like a little bit of a red herring. Like, what does free trade have to do with an end to the war in Europe? Well, trade is connected to the reason that the United States ultimately does get involved in the First World War, the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, which, remember, is directed not just against Allied ships, but against neutral third-party ships, particularly those ships from the United States. So that's reason one. But reason two is that Wilson sees trade as both a means to an end and an end in itself. That trade in itself is good, but the thing is that if you trade with other countries, you become economically dependent on that trade. And if you become economically dependent on other countries, if, for example, if you're dependent on, let's say, the Middle East in general for energy, for oil, and a war means that your energy sources, your energy supply is going to be cut off, then that's debatably going to make you think twice about going to war with other countries. The idea is that with interdependence, there is kind of some security there. And this is, you could kind of argue, an American approach to foreign policy. And it's not just something that Woodrow Wilson supports. President Bill Clinton in the 1990s, for example, believed that you should trade with your friends and trade with your enemies, and especially trade with your enemies. The idea being is that with trade comes power. And not only will other countries become dependent upon you, but with trade comes culture. And so, as other countries import your goods, they're also going to import everything from Disney to McDonald's. And the sheer economic and cultural power of the United States can shape attitudes and behaviors. So this is something that really starts with Wilson in the 14 points, but it goes a long way, actually. Now, we talked about the problems of, of let's say, the fact that nations don't have laws. Individuals have laws, but to be honest, except for a few documents and a few conventions, like the Hague Convention, there are a few sources like Grotius's overview of the laws of nations. There is no such thing as binding international law. There's no such thing as an international court where nations can kind of bring their grievances and complaints to a neutral third party and expect justice. Woodrow Wilson wants to change that, and he wants to change that with the creation of something called the League of Nations. So Wilson's endgame for the First World War doesn't involve an exchange of territory. Instead, it involves the creation of some kind of permanent international system of justice. So the 14 points isn't some kind of pie in the sky idea that Wilson just kind of, throws against a wall to see if it sticks. Instead, the 14 points, the context of the 14 points is that it's a list of what the United States wants in the event of the end of hostilities in Europe. It's Wilson's roadmap to a peace plan. And so Wilson sort of puts out the 14 points and waits to see what the reaction is from the Western Allies and the Central Powers. And interestingly, one of the biggest fans of the 14 points was the German military and the German government. And that might seem a little weird because people like Kaiser Wilhelm II, people like Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, the two generals who really ruled Germany during this time period, they weren't really interested in highfalutin ideas like a League of Nations or self-determination. But what they saw in the 14 points is an opportunity to get out of the war while the getting was good. In our last lecture on the end of the First World War, I mentioned that Germany was in a serious economic and political crisis. You had leftist revolutionary groups rising up, and there was concern that Germany would, if Germany capitulated, then they would have to give up basically all of their empire, their power, their influence in Europe. The thing is that Wilson's argument is that exchanges of territory, indemnities, that just causes a bigger problem. It might actually facilitate or create a later war in the future. And so when the Germans hear that there's this peace plan proposed by President Wilson that doesn't require them to give up land or territory, the Germans are like, sold. They announce that they are interested in pursuing peace negotiations based upon the model put forward by Woodrow Wilson. In other words, the 14 points. So Germany embraces that plan, and Wilson kind of becomes an international celebrity. When Wilson actually goes to Paris, he's actually treated as an almost messianic figure. Vive Wilson, by the way, for you non-French linguists. Viva Wilson, that's not his first name. It means like long live Woodrow Wilson. And you can kind of see this parade where people are gathered to kind of view Wilson's, arrival in Paris. And it has to be said that Wilson was a charismatic public speaker, actually, probably one of the greatest speakers that has ever been elected president. And also, Woodrow Wilson's trip to Paris marks the first time that any sitting American president has traveled abroad to another country while in office. So it's a historic moment for a variety of reasons. Now, as it turns out, Wilson going to Paris for a very long time proves to be a miscalculation for reasons we'll kind of get into in just a second. But again, Wilson is not only treated as a celebrity by Europeans, but also by non-Europeans living in countries and colonies controlled by European powers. One of the individuals in Paris who is kind of entranced by Wilson and his message of self-determination is a cook, a Vietnamese cook working in the New Zealand embassy. And this cook, by the way, was part of a broader political organization that was trying to push for the independence of French Indochina, which is basically modern day Vietnam. And this cook requested to see Woodrow Wilson because he was enamored with Wilson, and he thought that because Wilson was a fan of self-determination and freedom and democracy, that Wilson would support the idea of colonized nations becoming independent. And what happens is that this cook is rebuffed. He's turned away by Woodrow Wilson's staff because, unbeknownst to this cook, Woodrow Wilson believed that self-determination is something that should be reserved for white Europeans, not non-white colonial subjects. Now, this cook that I've referenced, his name is actually Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh later on becomes the leader of North Vietnam and is one of our chief adversaries during the Vietnam War. And arguably, and historians can kind of debate this point, this is a really decisive moment in the history of the 20th century. Because again, we've been sort of building up the Cold War in our discussion of World War I. And there are some, strong connections between the First World War and the Second World War and the First World War and the Cold War. And this is one of them. What happens is that during the Cold War, the United States is locked in this ongoing geopolitical struggle with the Soviet Union. And that geopolitical struggle plays out in Europe, but it also plays out in what we would call the developing world, areas of the world that used to be occupied by European powers but are now independent. It plays out in places like Vietnam. It plays out in India and Pakistan, in the Middle East more broadly, Egypt. It basically takes place in those areas that were occupied by European powers. And one of the reasons why the Cold War takes place in the developing world is because Ho Chi Minh and many leaders like Ho Chi Minh see Wilson as a savior. They buy into this idea of self-determination and democracy. But Wilson turns them away. And that's not Wilson, the proponent of democracy or self-determination, turning them away. This is Wilson, the supporter of Jim Crow. Wilson, the president who publicly screens the movie Birth of a Nation in the White House. And so at this point, The question is, if you are Ho Chi Minh or other leaders during this time period who are interested in achieving independence, whether that's Mahatma Gandhi or individuals like Nelson Mandela. This time period witnesses the birth of many national independence leaders, and the question is, who's going to be their friend? What large, powerful country could possibly champion their cause for independence? And theoretically, the United States, kind of being the combo breaker, sort of being the hipster who achieves independence from a European power first, it would have the credibility to kind of support leaders like Ho Chi Minh in seeking national independence as well. But Wilson turns them down. So the only other large, powerful country um, that could possibly support them is the Soviet Union. The thing is that communism has tons of faults, obviously, but one of the things that communism was consistent about, however, is the idea that racism was something that was just nonsense. And so the Soviet Union kind of positions itself in the Cold War as a champion of the developing world. And so arguably this decision at Versailles to basically make self-determination something that applies only for European countries has very, very significant consequences after the fact. So that being said, let's talk about what is actually decided upon at Versailles and the way the League of Nations works more broadly. So um, the Treaty of Versailles is basically passed in a draft state in 1919, and it creates a League of Nations. Now, the thing is that one of the things that make courts so powerful is the fact that courts can hand down sentences, right? If you break the rules, there are consequences, ranging from fines to imprisonment, and in some cases, even death. The question is, what enforcement mechanism is the League of Nations going to have? And the primary enforcement mechanism is going to be sanctions, where basically you use trade, or the lack of trade, the threat of cutting countries off from trade, as basically the primary tool of forcing countries to comply with international law. This is one of the other reasons why Woodrow Wilson is such a fan of free trade, because not only does he philosophically agree with it in principle, the idea is that you use free trade as kind of like a form of deterrence in itself, because if you become dependent on other countries, if suddenly you're cut off economically, that can seriously impact your country's standard of living. So that's the idea. Now, the thing is that the league itself theoretically is going to be controlled by the Big Five. Basically, these are the victorious Allied powers during the First World War: Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. More on that a little bit later, but just so you know, the Big Five were kind of like the five permanent members of the Security Council today, in the sense that they can veto whatever proposed resolutions in the league sessions. So the thing is, though, that France, Britain, and the other allies, they do kind of get their way. They ask for reparations, and of course, Germany does have to pay them. So France receives something like $31.4 billion in reparations. And in 2016 terms, this is equal to about $500 billion today. Um, you still have territorial exchanges in Europe. Basically, Alsace-Lorraine, which is a French province, or sorry, German province, goes back to France. But also, what kind of happens is that once self-determination is unleashed, the map of Europe becomes much more complicated. You see the emergence of Poland, of Ukraine, of numerous independent Baltic states and Balkan states. In 1914, if you had to take a map quiz or a geography quiz or a political geography quiz on Europe, it's pretty easy, actually, because really most of Europe is controlled by, 5 to 7 large imperial powers. The thing is that the First World War eliminates the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I think I said three. Actually, it's more like four. It also eliminates the Ottoman Empire. The only large empires left in Europe are really the French and the British. And by the way, the First World War doesn't exterminate their empires, but it only grants them a reprieve, because by the end of the Second World War, the French and British empires crumble. So you have territorial exchanges in Europe based upon this whole idea of self-determination. So Poland, which used to be carved up between Germany, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it becomes independent under the idea that the Polish people should have the right to choose what type of government they're going to have and whether or not they want to rule themselves. That's kind of an isolated example, but there are other examples as well. The new nation of Czechoslovakia, for example. The thing is that you have self-determination that is sort of given to dozens of different European nationalities, but it's not extended to non-Europeans. But it's also not extended to, for example, the defeated Central Powers. So the thing is that there are Germans in Poland, in areas of Czechoslovakia. The territory they lived in used to be Germany, but now it's part of the new nation of Poland or Czechoslovakia. The question is, do you give German communities living in those areas the right of self-determination? And the answer is no. They either have to move back to Germany, or they are now citizens of the new country that they happen to live in. And just to kind of show you how complicated some of this can be, there was a story of this woman who lived a long time during the 20th century. So long that apparently she was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then she grew up in, I think, Poland, then Ukraine, then, what was it? The Soviet Union, and then back to Ukraine. And I think I'm probably butchering the retelling, but supposedly she never really moved during her entire lifetime. It's just that the borders of Europe changed so much during the 20th century. And so you can imagine, if your national identity is something that's important to you, this is going to complicate matters quite a bit. So anyway, those territorial exchanges will come back and be important in the Second World War, but I just want to go ahead and kind of create that foundation for you. So the other thing that happens is that for Germany specifically, the German army is capped at 100,000 soldiers. And also, Germany has to accept what's called the War Guilt Clause. Basically, this clause that says that World War I is entirely the fault of Germany. Now, that is very controversial for obvious reasons, because from the German perspective, all they are guilty of doing is being a good friend, of standing up for their Austrian allies after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. But the British and the French would point out that Germany was by far the most powerful and effective member of the Central Powers. And so while Germany might not have causally started the war was horrible because of Germany. I should mention that what was agreed upon on November 11th of 1918 was an armistice, a pause in the fighting. That didn't necessarily mean that the war couldn't continue if negotiations broke down. And supposedly, at this point, the German delegation to Versailles threatened to walk out. Germany wasn't consulted about any of these other stipulations in the treaty. Basically, the Allied powers came together and proposed this agreement, and Germany was just asked to sign, including admitting full responsibility. The Germans refused. Then the Allies basically say that if Germany refuses to sign the Treaty of Versailles, then hostilities will commence again. At this point, the Germans know that there's no way that they could possibly continue fighting. Their economy is in shambles. Their army has, for the most part, been demobilized. So the Germans are forced to actually sign the Treaty of Versailles with the war guilt clause. Now, this is very, very important because this gives rise to what's called the Dolchstoß legend in Germany. Lance, if you're listening, I know that's an S-that. I don't really know how to put that in, how to type that in Mac. But anyway, the Dolchstoß legend is the legend of the stab in the back. So the stab in the back legend goes something like this. If you look at World War I, the German army itself isn't really defeated. It's pushed back, it's bloodied, but the army more or less retreats back to German borders in good order. And actually, the entirety of the First World War, at least on the Western Front, occurs outside of Germany. No Allied soldiers actually cross over the Rhine River and into Germany proper. German territory is defended through the entire war. And so what kind of happens is that the German people after the war are trying to rationalize how it was they were defeated. And so they point out that their army is still capable, was fighting all the way to the end of the war. And so really, the army, it's not the fact that the army was defeated, it's the revolutions that erupted in 1918 that really destroyed Germany in the First World War. Now, here is the very important point. So, these revolutions were primarily revolutions led by leftist and socialist parties. And some of these parties were represented or led by Jewish individuals. And there's a historical reason for this because in most of the major German political parties, Germany's largest, or basically the two largest political parties in Germany were explicitly Christian parties. You have like there was a Catholic party, there was basically some kind of sort of Christian conservative party in Germany. If you were Jewish, for example, I mean, if you're Jewish, you're by definition not Christian. And so Jewish people were basically sidelined from most of the major political parties in Germany, except for the Socialist Party and other sort of socialist parties. What happens is that the revolutions that occur in 1918 are primarily blamed on socialists and Jews. And in the German mind, especially the German mind in the 1920s and 1930s. Jews and socialists kind of merge together. They become basically the same person. And this is, again, very, very important because we've talked about the fact that if you're looking at, at countries that were the most anti-Semitic in Europe, Russia kind of tops the list. Germany's not exactly a utopia for Jewish people, but it's certainly a far cry from the Germany that you see in the Holocaust. And to me, as a historian, there's something deeply unsettling about that because again there's that you sometimes hear historians talk about the emergence of the Holocaust dating back to just traditional European anti-Semitism, the idea that Jewish people were responsible for killing Jesus Christ, the anti-Semitism sort of expressed by Martin Luther. But again, if you look at Jews in Germany during the late 19th and early 20th century, they weren't necessarily treated any worse than any of the other major European countries. The thing is that anti-Semitism doesn't just you know pop up or sorry doesn't occur because of things that have been set in motion across thousands of years. In the case of Germany, the short-term reasons for the Holocaust develop very, very quickly. And again, that's one of the more unsettling points, I think, of this lesson. So, that being said, Wilson doesn't get exactly what he wants at Versailles, but on the other hand, he does get buy-in from most of the allied countries for his idea of the League of Nations. And that's pretty extraordinary. Wilson goes to Europe to change the world. And to be honest, he wins. He gets the French, the Germans, the British, the Italians, the Japanese, the Chinese, and a whole host of other nations to agree to his plan for the League of Nations. But now Wilson has to face his most challenging opponent. And no, it's not the guy from the Dos Equis commercials. It is Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge was the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Lodge was particularly irate with Woodrow Wilson because of some short-term and long-term issues. The long-term problem is the fact that World War I was one of those big wars in American history. And in World War I, we see a lot of power concentrate around the executive branch. And remember, there's this understanding that after the war is over, that power should be returned to the legislative branch and Congress should be brought back in. And remember, this is something that even Abraham Lincoln had to deal with. And Abraham Lincoln just had this sort of naturally easygoing personality. Woodrow Wilson was many things, but easygoing was not one of them. He took himself very seriously, and I'm pretty sure that the man really didn't have much of a sense of humor. So Woodrow Wilson goes to Versailles for about 6 months. Not only does he leave the country, he leaves the country for a very long period of time. He takes personal responsibility for the negotiations and doesn't really bring Congress in on what those negotiations actually look like. So Henry Cabot Lodge is very concerned about the whole idea of the League of Nations. And one of the reasons why Lodge is concerned is not because he's necessarily an isolationist. It was kind of easy for some historians and to be honest, some history textbooks to kind of characterize Lodge as this grouchy sort of America First isolationist. Lodge was none of those things. Lodge was a close friend of Theodore Roosevelt. He kind of came from that internationalist wing of the Republican Party. So he's not an isolationist. Instead, Lodge and 39 other Republicans were very concerned about the language of the League of Nations Charter itself. So in the League of Nations Charter, there is, I think it's Article 9, which is basically a clause that calls for mutual self-defense. If you attack one member of the League, it's an attack, in effect, on all members of the League. Well, the question is, I mean, let's say that, for example, the British Empire in the Middle East is attacked because the British go back on their word and refuse to grant independence to Middle Eastern states like Iraq and parts of Syria, Palestine, etc. What if there is an uprising there against British rule? Well, under the language of the League of Nations Charter, would that obligate the United States to actually defend the British Empire if need be? It's not really clear, and that's part of the problem. The language of the League itself isn't all that clear. So what happens, though, is, at this point, Lodge is just interested in getting Wilson to explain some of the unclear provisions of the League of Nations. But Wilson, who again takes himself very, very seriously, refuses to budge on anything, refuses to change a single word. And it seems like in this time period, Wilson almost views himself like a religious prophet, as somebody who is almost sacrosanct. Georges Clemenceau, the French president, famously quipped that God himself only needed 10 commandments, but Wilson gives us 14, which kind of gives us an idea of how sanctimonious he was kind of becoming at this point. So, what happens is that Wilson goes home to try to drum up support for the League. And what he does is, instead of negotiating directly with Congress, he instead decides to go around the country and go directly to the American people and put pressure on Republican dissenters in Congress. Now, you might remember that earlier in Wilson's career, I think I might have said this to a couple of classes, Wilson has a stroke when he is basically studying abroad in the United Kingdom. Or I think he's teaching abroad at this point. Around this time period, he's in his 40s. And basically what happens is that he works so hard that he has a stroke. And he's told by his doctor that he should just go ahead and retire early. Have a life of leisure, and under no circumstances should he ever do anything that's strenuous or taxing, like maybe running for president, which, by the way, suggests that Wilson did not follow his doctor's instructions. He basically adopts this regimen in which he runs and exercises, but he basically just tries to work through it. Now, what happens is that during the First World War, Wilson is taxed quite a bit. He's even taxed more at the Versailles Peace Conference in Paris. And now that the treaty itself has been drafted and agreed upon by the Allied powers, he has to go back home and get it approved in Congress. Because remember, anytime you have an international treaty, the Senate is required to approve it. The other thing that Wilson does to make things even more difficult for him is that, remember, Henry Cabot Lodge isn't objecting to the Treaty of Versailles per se. He's objecting to the League of Nations. Well, what Wilson does to kind of raise the stakes is he basically combines the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations together in one bill. It's basically a big omnibus bill. You either approve of both the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, or you reject both. And of course, this is kind of like a high-stakes game of poker, because Wilson is assuming that surely Henry Cabot Lodge, being rational, is not going to vote down the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles, because at that point, the United States would still be at war. Who's going to be dumb enough to do that? Henry Cabot Lodge is thinking, well, surely the president is going to compromise, because if there is no compromise, then we're not going to end the war. And we're also not going to have the League. So what happens is that it's not so much a game of poker as much as a game of chicken. And both individuals assume that the other will flinch first. So the thing is that Wilson combines the two together, the League and the Treaty of Versailles, and he also becomes less and less willing to compromise. He decides, instead of compromising with Congress, again, that he's going to tour around the country to take his message directly to the American people. And it's at that point, just as popular opinion is beginning to turn, that he has a stroke. One so devastating that Woodrow Wilson will never speak in public again. Remember that Wilson's major advantage is that he's just naturally one of these great public speakers. And this stroke takes away that greatest asset. In fact, Wilson's condition is so bad that, in effect, his wife, Edith Wilson, runs the country more or less on his behalf. She's not exactly, I don't think you can call her the first female president in American history, but the fact is that Edith Wilson got to choose which cabinet secretary got to see the president. Orders from Woodrow Wilson were written in Edith's own hand. And the thing is that it wasn't really all that clear, where Wilson's ideas ended and Edith's began. The other thing, though, is that there's nothing in the Constitution that measures mental fitness. It has to be said that the Constitution was written during the Enlightenment, but it's still before the idea that mental illness was seen as a medical problem. I mean, we still kind of have that idea during the time that unfitness, that, problems of capacity were problems related to demons as opposed to, medical phenomenon. And that's maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much of one. And the Wilson administration, many of his cabinet secretaries were putting pressure on his vice president, Thomas Marshall of Indiana, to declare the president unfit for office. And if Marshall had tried to do that, that is an incredible slippery slope. He refuses to do that because he's, let's say, uncomfortable about where that will take the country. But with all that being said, Wilson's stroke makes him even less willing to compromise, and so that game of chicken that Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge have been playing ends with neither side flinching. Wilson's version of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations goes to the Senate for approval, and it gets voted down. So what this means is that the United States doesn't sign or ratify the Treaty of Versailles. It also doesn't really join the League of Nations. And the problem with this is that the United States is virtually, by virtue of Woodrow Wilson, the architect of the League of Nations. and it doesn't join. And that gap, that leadership vacuum, is commonly mentioned when people talk about the problems of the League of Nations. The fact of the matter is that the League of Nations and the United Nations today are fairly similar in how they function. A lot of the same criticisms of the League of Nations are also mentioned about the United Nations. One of the few differences between the two organizations is the fact that in the League of Nations, the United States doesn't join. In the United Nations, however, the United States does join. It kind of learns its lesson after the fact. So it's almost like we end this with a Greek tragedy. The United States goes to war in 1917 to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson's answer as to how to make the world safe for democracy is with democracy and with the principle of self-determination. And the thing is that almost the entire world buys into that idea, but Congress doesn't. And Congress doesn't buy into it, not because Congress doesn't believe in democracy or self-determination, but instead because Woodrow Wilson refused to compromise. So it's a tragic end to a really stunning development. The United States tries to change the world and almost succeeds. It just fails near the finish line because of Wilson's hubris, more or less. Fortunately, one of Wilson's, I don't want to say proteges, but observers, is his assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By the way, yet another Roosevelt who's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt is closely monitoring and sort of studying his boss's successes as well as his boss's failures. And when that Roosevelt is eventually elected president and finds himself in yet another European war, he is quick to make changes so as he doesn't repeat some of his boss's failures and mistakes. More on that later.